Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 15. I'm Sorry. Tally entered the police department like she would on any other day. She had a cheerful smile on her lips and was feeling genuinely happy to finally be back at work. On her way through the lobby, she turned to her right and sent over a quick wave to Devon, their receptionist, and general good soul of the place. The woman returned a gesture and smiled warmly. "It's good to see you back, Detective Craven. Are you feeling better?" "Yes, I feel like a completely new woman," Tally replied while she was stepping inside the elevator. She closed her eyes and hummed along quietly to the familiar tunes of the elevator music until it came to a halt. She heard the door slide aside, and only opened her eyes again once she had stepped out of the elevator and into the hallway. Then she hesitated and carefully looked around. At the first glance, everything looked exactly like it always did. Nothing out of the ordinary. The hallway that led to the bullpen was empty, the lights turned on, and the door to the kitchen closed. Still, she could hear the grinding sound of the old coffee machine from inside. In fact, that was what had made her pause. Usually the whole floor was filled with noises. Tally could hear the tapping sound of fingers eagerly typing something into the computers. Phones were ringing, and the general buzzing of people laughing and talking was floating through the air. But now, the suddenly way too loud rhythmic rustling of the coffee machine was the only sound that Tally could hear. Other than that, it was completely quiet. Too quiet. She carefully walked through the hallway and could hear her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Her vision blurred slightly, and it felt like she was walking through some sort of tunnel. A strange sensation overcame her. Her throat suddenly felt incredibly tight, and an uneasy feeling started to spread from her stomach, through her whole body. When she stepped inside the bullpen, she automatically kept her gaze low. She couldn't really explain why. She simply did. Later, she figured out, it must have been an unconscious protective reaction of her brain. But now, the first thing Tally spotted was a stain of something dark red on the ground. She stopped in her tracks, and an ice-cold shiver ran over her when she realized what it was. Blood. This was blood. She didn't want to, didn't dare to, but knowing she didn't have much of a choice, Tally slowly raised her head and found her worst suspicions confirmed. Because the second thing she spotted was Petra Bellwether's lifeless body lying on the ground right in front of her. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth distorted into a gruesome, wordless scream. Her throat had been slit, her vocal cords probably removed, and the blood was quietly dropping on the ground. "No," Tally breathed, unable to contain the rising panic in her chest any longer. The Camarilla killer had struck again, right here, at a place where everyone had felt safe. But that wasn't all of it. Without really intending to, Tally's head seemed to move on its own accord, and turned, making it impossible for her to escape any of this. Image after image was hitting her, bombarding her, overwhelming her, like pieces of a puzzle that slowly revealed the full horror in front of her. A strand of Detective Batan's black hair, barely visible, looked out from behind her desk. Her arm was outstretched and completely still on the wooden floor. Royale and Abigail slumped down next to each other, their rigid bodies leaning against the wall. Their faces no longer recognizable and completely covered in blood, their limbs unnaturally twisted. 2 golden medals were dangling around their necks, and the engraved pentagram burned its way into Tally's mind. She dropped to her knees, her legs unable to carry the weight of her body any longer. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out of it. Captain Bellwether, Detective Bataan, Abigail, Rael, they were all dead. Murdered. She buried her face in her hands, closed her eyes, and sobbed quietly. Then she heard a shuffling sound to her left, and her head snapped back up. Tally gasped, and for a split second all of the darkness inside of her was enlightened by a flash of hope, when she spotted no other than Sarah Aldrich standing right next to her, breathing and very much alive. "Alder?" Tally's words were barely more than a strangled whisper. She lifted her arm in a weak attempt to get her partner's attention, but Alder didn't seem to notice her. In fact, she didn't seem to notice anything. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her gaze was completely empty, and she looked right through Tally with glassy eyes. Another cold shiver ran down Tally's spine, and when she spoke up again, her voice was louder, her words a desperate plea. "Alder, please! Please look at me!" Alder didn't react. It was like she was stuck in some sort of trance, unable to understand anything that was happening around her. Then, Tally's attention was pulled away from her partner as a strange, high-pitched sound of laughter started to resonate through the room. Tally frantically turned her head, all of her senses on high alert, but couldn't make out the source of the noise. Her eyes were back on Alder, who still hadn't moved an inch. Another sound made Tally startle, and her eyes widened in shock when out of nowhere a dark figure appeared behind her partner's body. With its appearance, the light in the whole room seemed to change. It got darker, gloomier, undermining the grotesque atmosphere of the scenery. Tally was fully transfixed by the hooded figure, unable to look away. She wanted to know who that person was, needed to know, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make out their face or any other detail about their appearance. The only thing that Tally could clearly see was the shining silver blade of the knife they were holding in their hand. Tally's breath hitched, and her blood seemed to freeze in her veins when she watched the person stepping even closer to Alder, who was still completely unresponsive. The stranger was now standing directly behind her, and without any hesitation, lifted the knife and pressed it against Alder's throat. A voice reached Tally's ears, a voice that sounded like none Tally had ever heard before, and yet was oddly familiar. It echoed through the room, resonated from the walls, and was soon filling the whole space. The person said only 6 words, but they were enough to make Tally's face twist in horror. "This is your fault, Tally Craven." Then, before Tally had any chance to react, the stranger cut Alder's throat in one swift movement. Tally couldn't move. She was frozen in her place, unable to do anything but watch how Alder's hand slowly reached up, and her eyes dropped down, staring at her own blood dripping from her fingers in disbelief. Tally started to whimper. "Alder!" She quietly sobbed her partner's name over and over again. "Alder! Alder! Alder!" She watched Alder drop to her knees, the last signs of life slowly leaving her body, and before Tally knew it, her whimpers turned into loud screams, and she was running through the room towards her dying partner. "Sarah! Sarah! Sarah!" Tally had almost reached her and was already stretching out her hand to touch her, to somehow ease her pain, and let her know that she wasn't alone when the room started to spin. She was suddenly no longer an active part of the scene, but was rather watching it unfold through the mist, unable to get a clear picture, unable to move, unable to react. Voices started to rain down on her, hitting her from every direction. Hurst, the barkeeper of Fort Salem, singing out of tune, mixed with the deep, taunting laugh of Director Silver, an unknown female voice that was screaming, "All witches must burn!" and someone familiar calling out her own name from the distance. The last sound was barely audible, but it was the one that seemed to draw Tally in the most. She let herself get taken away by it, knew that, for some reason, she needed to hang on to it, And so she did. And with each passing moment, that voice grew louder and clearer, making it easier for Tally to focus. Then everything went dark, and when Tally opened her eyes again, she found herself in a completely different place. Her eyes widened in confusion as she took in the room in front of her. Clean, white linoleum floors, gray walls, the smell of disinfectant in the air, a strange, rhythmically beeping sound, which was starting to ring in her ears. Tally herself, she then realized, was lying in an uncomfortable bed with a metal frame. She could feel another wave of panic rising up inside of her, but then, out of the corner of her eye, noticed a hand reaching out, carefully petting her hair, comforting her. Tally almost instantly leaned into the touch, enjoying the sudden sense of security it was giving her. Then she turned her head and stared right into a familiar pair of icy blue eyes that were filled with nothing but worry and concern. "Shh, Tally, it's all right. You are all right. You are safe," Alder spoke in a soft voice, and her words managed to calm Tally down almost immediately. She blinked, absolutely overwhelmed by everything that was going on, and when she managed to clear her throat and spoke up, the light trace of panic was still clearly audible in her voice. "What happened?" "You were screaming in your sleep." Alder's voice dropped slightly, and suddenly she sounded almost shy. "You kept screaming my name over and over again. I figured you must be going through some sort of nightmare, so I tried to wake you up." Tally nodded slowly, still too far gone for being embarrassed about the fact that she had been screaming for Alder in her sleep. Her mind was still spinning, the images of her dream forever engraved into her memory. It all had felt so incredibly real. In her head, she could still hear the sound of the coffee machine, Alder's gasp, the stranger's voice calling to her, mocking her, blaming her. Her heartbeat quickened at the memory, and her breathing got shallow. The rapid beeping that still filled the room seemed to increase its speed, and Tally felt Alder's hand moving from her hair down to her shoulder, pressing it reassuringly in an attempt to calm her down. Once more, her touch seemed to do the trick, and Tally relaxed enough to gather her thoughts a bit. Her brain finally managed to connect the dots, and everything became a little bit clearer. A hospital. She was in a hospital. Why was she in a hospital? "Why am I here?" Tally managed to press out. "You don't remember anything?" Alder replied almost immediately, and proceeded to draw a pattern of small, reassuring circles all over Tally's arm. Tally took some time to consider her question, then shook her head slowly. "I remember being called to the crime scene. I remember seeing Libba's dead body. I remember arguing with you." Tally's voice dropped slightly, and she spotted Alder's mouth twisting in guilt, something she decided to ignore for now. "I remember seeing someone move behind the window of the old fabric building. I remember walking inside and then nothing." It followed a moment of silence, in which Tally quietly put the pieces together in her head. Then realization finally hit her, and she released a shocked gasp. "He got me, didn't he?" Alder only nodded in response, but it was all Tally needed, all she could take at the moment. Her head was spinning, and hundreds of questions were tumbling inside of her. The most pressing one, though, was the one that was scaring her the most, and when she had finally gathered enough courage to ask it, she tried her best to keep her words as plain as possible, afraid that if she would show too many emotions now, she wouldn't be able to hold back at all. "Alder? Why am I still alive?" She saw Alder twitch at her words, and a dark shadow fell over her face. When she replied, her own words seemed to pain her more than she was willing to show. "We have absolutely no idea." Tally's face remained completely impassive, still processing the full extent of what had happened to her, of what Alder had just said to her. Then another terrifying thought crossed her mind, one that was enough to send another wave of uncomfortable goosebumps over her body. She almost didn't dare to ask, didn't know if she wanted to hear the answer, didn't know if she would be able to deal with it, if she could take it. Still, she needed to know. Has he... She was visibly struggling with her words and no longer able to stop a small sob from escaping her. But Alder understood her anyway. Telly felt a soft pressure on her hand, and when she looked down, noticed Alder's fingers being intertwined with her own. They must have been the entire time. Alder gently pressed her hand, then reassured her quickly. No, Telly, don't worry. He didn't touch you. Not like that anyway. Relief flooded through Telly, and she felt like a heavy weight was lifted off her chest. She exhaled loudly. It was all right. Everything was all right. The Camarilla killer didn't kill her. He didn't even touch her. She was here, alive and well. Driven by that relief, her thoughts started to wander a bit, and Telly realized something else that actually managed to bring a tiny smile to her face. She turned back to Alder and raised her eyebrows almost teasingly. Telly, huh? You know this is the first time I've heard you saying my name? To her amusement, Alder actually blushed at her statement. Sorry. Don't be, I like it. Telly felt herself searching for Alder's blue eyes, and when she finally met her gaze, allowed herself for a moment to get lost in the familiar feelings the contact evoked inside of her. There were still so many unspoken things hanging between them, but at that moment, it was as if the argument between them, all the pushing and the hurtful words, had never happened. At that moment, they were simply enjoying each other's company. The moment, however, was over far too quickly, and soon Telly noticed a dark shadow that had returned to linger over Alder's face. Alder's words from earlier started to repeat in her head. He didn't touch you. Not like that, anyway. There was something that Alder was not telling her, and Telly needed to know. So her next words were straightforward and simple again, the playfulness in her voice completely gone. Alder, I can feel that there is something more. What are you keeping from me? What did he do to me? He didn't hurt you, at least not physically, Alder sighed, ultimately breaking the eye contact between them. But he wrote something on your body. With blood. Libba's blood. We have no idea how he got it. It's impossible that he planned to take you. So for now, we believe that he must be keeping some blood of all of his victims. His own personal souvenir of sorts. The thought alone made Telly shiver in disgust. She was absolutely horrified. What did he write? He drew a pentagram all over your face, and when you were found, your limbs were outstretched in a way that you could clearly read the words "next time" on the inside of your upper arms. Telly's gaze automatically dropped down to her arms, and she released a breath she didn't know she was holding when she found nothing but clear, creamy skin. Alder noticed the gaze and cleared her throat, while she awkwardly started to play with Telly's hair, suddenly looking very self-conscious. Don't worry, I made sure to get it all off you as soon as I arrived at the scene. Telly wasn't sure if she had misheard, but when Alder bit her lower lip and once again seemed too flustered to meet her gaze, Telly's curiosity won. You got it off of me? That's actually a bit of an embarrassing story. I'm sure Nikta will happily tell you everything about it. Well, now Telly really needed to know. If I'm totally honest, I'd rather hear it from you. She let her eyes wander down her body, which was covered by a thin hospital blanket, then looked over to the IV bag in her arm. I think I deserve some cheering up. Alder grumbled something that sounded a suspicious lot like, I can't believe you're pulling the pity card on me already, but then sighed in defeat. I won't be able to hide it from you anyway. When I arrived at the scene, they had already loaded you into an ambulance. You were obviously still unconscious, so I knew you wouldn't remember any of this. But when I saw you laying there, with these deformations all over your body, seeing his mark on you, knowing he touched you, I guess I simply stopped thinking and acted on instinct. I grabbed the water bottle, rushed over to the ambulance, and used the sleeve of my jacket to wash the blood off of you. But then Sterling from forensics noticed me. You mean 6'4" Sterling from forensics? The very same. Alder was still staring down, but Tally encouraged her, slightly impatient, to continue. So I might have yelled at him to fuck off, then punched him in the face and continued with my work. Alder responded, speaking so quickly that Tally almost didn't get her words. You punched him in the face? She all but blurted out, unable to contain the amusement in her voice. And it was glorious. Yup, I can confirm that. The guy didn't get back up for a whole minute afterwards, and I'm sure she broke his nose. Two very familiar voices sounded from the door, and Tally let out another relieved sob when she spotted Raelle and Abigail standing in the doorframe. She'd have known you would want her all to yourself. Abigail shot in Alder's direction, but didn't even try to hide the playful undertone of her voice. Raelle was grinning as well, and within seconds, the two women had made their way through the room, pulling Tally in a tight embrace that almost ripped the IV right out of her arm. Tally couldn't care less, and returned the hug just as eagerly. After her dream, she was happier than ever to see her best friends alive and breathing. Out of the corner of her eyes, she noticed Alder stepping back to give them some privacy. But before she could react to it, Abigail and Raelle were asking for her full attention. You scared the shit out of us, Craven. Don't you ever dare pull something like that again, or I might have to kill you myself. Promise I won't, Tally chuckled. Then she heard Alder clearing her throat, and when she turned her head, the older woman was slowly walking towards the door. I think I will leave you alone now. I'm sure these two will take perfect care of you, and you really need some rest. She suddenly seemed very distant again, like someone had pushed the switch. Still, everything inside of Tally screamed to ask her to stay. Alder's presence calmed her down more than anything else. She wanted her clothes. Needed her clothes. They still didn't talk about their argument, and she felt like, if she would let Alder walk through that door, this would only give her more time to build up her walls, to come up with excuses to avoid the inevitable confrontation. But she knew that now was not the time, especially not with Raelle and Abigail in the room, and her kind of very recent return out of the grasp of a serial killer. There was still a lot to process, for both of them, and Tally was not sure if she would be able to handle another rejection. That would most definitely be sent her way. So she only nodded. Thank you for staying with me. She was fully hovering over you, by the way, Raelle mumbled under her breath beside her. Wouldn't leave your bed for a second. I swear if you would have slept any longer, we would have needed to force-feed her. Touched by Raelle's words and Alder's obvious concern, Tally smiled at her partner warmly, who was now already standing in the doorway. Try not to miss me too much. I'll be back at work before you know it. Her words seemed to trigger something in Alder. Her partner looked down and started to shift uncomfortably. Next to her, Tally could also feel Abigail tense up. She frowned in confusion, and after a moment of awkward silence, Alder finally seemed to have found her voice again. Well, about that. Don't worry, I'll wait until I'm officially cleared to come back. I know I need rest, and won't return until I'm 100% certain that I can handle it. But I feel completely fine, and you said it yourself that I'm completely unharmed, Tally rambled, desperately hoping that Alder being concerned for her was the only reason for the sudden tension in the room. But when Alder spoke again, her voice was hard and her face blank. Craven, I asked Petra and Nikta to take you off the case, and they agreed. For a moment, Tally simply stared at her in complete disbelief. You did what? It's for the best. For whom? Tally's anger was pushing her to become louder with every word. For you? Because it gives you another opportunity to run away from your feelings? Because you think you are protecting me with this? Alder, what the fuck? This is my life. This is my choice. How dare you take that away from me? I'm sorry, Alder responded quietly, her words final. Then she turned around and walked into the hallway, letting the door fall shut behind her. Tally was cleared to go home by the doctors the same day. Apparently, she had indeed gotten very lucky. She still had a slight headache, caused by the blow to the head, and the doctors had found some light traces of an anesthetic in her blood. But other than that, she was completely fine and was only ordered to take it slow for the next week. These were good news. But unfortunately, it did nothing to ease the chaos in Tally's head. She didn't know it was even possible to feel so many things at once, and she felt like she was slowly drowning in her own thoughts. On the one hand, she was grateful to be back in one piece, safe and sound, completely unharmed. She was glad that her nightmare had been nothing but a dream, and that everyone in it was still alive. Was glad that she was still alive. But on the other hand, she was just so incredibly mad. Mad at herself for being dumb enough to head into that abandoned building all by herself, for giving Captain Bellwether a reason to take her off the case. Mad at Alder for shamelessly using that opportunity to push Tally away. Her actions were what hurt her more than anything else. She felt betrayed, disappointed, because once more her partner was choosing the easy way out. Alder was using her apparent wish for Tally's safety as another excuse for putting the case above her own happiness, and thus above Tally, destroying all the trust and honesty that they had worked so hard on building up between them. On her first night back home, Raelle and Abigail did their best to distract her from the whirlwind inside of her head. They spent their evening curled up in front of the TV and ended up sleeping together in Tally's bed. To her surprise, Tally actually slept through the night, the exhaustion clearly getting the best of her. The next day, however, proved to be much more difficult. Both Raelle and Abigail had to get back to work, which left Tally alone with her thoughts. She felt like she was going insane and had no idea what to do with herself, so she spent most of her time deep cleaning the apartment and absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. At some point, she even considered calling Alder, just to yell at her some more, but fortunately, she still had enough sanity left that stopped her. It was on that night, after she had spent hours tossing and turning in her bed, that her nightmares started again. Night after night, the dreams returned, all different yet strangely similar. Sometimes she would get pulled out of one, only to be directly thrown into the next. Tally would find herself in a familiar place, the police department, her apartment, even Silver's office, or the bar at Fort Salem. Each time she would discover the dead bodies of the people she cared about most. Each time she would have to watch Alder getting killed by a mysterious figure. And each time she would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart beating in her chest. It wasn't until the third night that Tally noticed that something about the recurring pattern was not like the rest. That something stood out. Something that kept repeating over and over again in each dream, and that Tally still wasn't familiar with. It was almost as if her mind was trying to tell her something, as if she was remembering something. But no matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't quite grasp it. On the fifth day, it finally hit her, and while she was wide awake in the middle of pouring herself a cup of tea, a set of images suddenly flashed up in her mind. A memory, intense enough that she dropped her cup and had to grab onto the kitchen counter for balance. A dim, windowless room, the smell of blood, delicate fingers touching her face, leaving a warm fluid behind. A voice whispering an all too familiar sentence. The feeling of something cold on her arm. A sharp sting. Darkness. Tally gasped loudly, and adrenaline rushed through her body when she finally figured out what had been bothering her all along. She was out of her apartment and on her way to the police department before she knew it. She rushed through the building, not quite able to repress the image of the terrible scene of her dreams that had felt so incredibly real. She forced herself to push through her own anxiety and discomfort, but was still incredibly relieved when she busted into the bullpen and no blood, golden medals, or all too familiar corpses awaited her. Instead, several heads turned in her direction, mustering her in confusion, but Tally had neither time nor patience for explanations and pleasantries. "Where is she?" she asked breathlessly, not even bothering to explain who she was looking for. She didn't have to. Everybody in the room already knew. One of the detectives nodded towards Captain Bellwether's office. "She's in there, with Batan and the captain. But they asked not to be disturbed, so I really don't think you should just head in there." But Tally had already turned on her heels, took a couple of steps and pushed open the door to the office, without knocking beforehand. When she stepped inside, the three women inside immediately stopped talking and stared at her in confusion and disbelief. It was Alder who spoke first. Of course it was. Craven, what the actual... Telly didn't give her the opportunity to finish the sentence. She was done being told what to do. Was done dancing around everyone to avoid stepping on anyone's toes. I know you don't want me here. I know I have messed up, and if you want to punish me by taking me off the case, then congratulations, you have succeeded. I can't do much about it, but I'm done being treated like some sort of stupid child that cannot make decisions for herself. I knew the risk when I agreed to work on the case. I understood the dangers that came with it, and I accepted it. So please, for one moment, stop acting as if you know it all, and just listen to what I have to say. Because right now, I'm the best shot of catching the Camarilla killer that you got. It followed a moment of stunned silence, that Telly desperately needed to catch her breath. She forced herself to straighten her back and simply stared ahead, no matter how intense the three women were staring at her. Finally, Detective Batin cleared her throat and cocked her eyebrow, intrigued. The best shot we've got? Please, Red, enlighten us. I remember, okay? I remember waking up while the Camarilla killer was putting Libba's blood on my body. I didn't see a face, but I heard a voice. Someone kept saying the same sentence over and over again until they realized I was awake and sedated me again. All witches must burn. That's what I heard. But that's not the point. The point is that one of the general assumptions we've made about the Camarilla killer has been wrong all along. The Camarilla killer is not a man. It's a woman. The voice I heard was definitely female. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.